When I first bought the plot, I thought I'd stumbled onto one of those rare opportunities where you can secure a little slice of peace and privacy for yourself. The land wasn't huge, just under 2 acres, but it had a few big oaks, a gentle slope down to a small creek, and enough distance from my neighbors to make me feel like I could breathe. I was in my mid-20s, serving in the military, and I wanted somewhere I could eventually build a home when my deployments slowed down. Until then, I figured I'd just pay the property taxes, keep it mowed when I was home, and otherwise let it sit as a quiet investment in my future. I wasn't much of a HOA person. In fact, I'd deliberately chosen the lot because it was in a subdivision with minimal rules, at least, that's what I thought. When I signed the papers, I skimmed over the covenant documents they gave me. I remember there being a lot of boilerplate about lawn care, fence height, and what kind of siding you could use on a house, none of which applied to me since I wasn't building yet. I did notice something about dues, but it seemed small, maybe $50 a year, and I figured I'd just pay it when it came up. What I didn't realize at the time was that this HOA had a nasty habit of interpreting the rules in ways that made them money. My first 2 years of ownership were uneventful. I deployed twice, each time for several months. While I was gone, I arranged for a buddy to check the place once in a while to make sure no one was dumping trash or messing around on the land. He'd send me a quick photo now and then, and I'd smile at the sight of those oaks still standing proud. I got a couple of letters from the HOA in that time, which I assumed were just generic newsletters. I didn't think much of it. Deployments have a way of making anything non-urgent slide to the bottom of the priority list. Then, during my third deployment, something strange happened. My buddy called me and said there was a for sale sign staked right in the middle of my property. At first, I thought maybe he'd gotten the wrong lot. But no, he sent me a photo, and sure enough, it was my land. The sign had the HOA's name on it. Now, there's nothing quite like being thousands of miles away in a war zone, already dealing with the constant stress of the job, and suddenly realizing someone back home is trying to steal from you. I called the number on the sign, using my extremely limited phone time, and asked what in the world was going on. The woman on the other end acted like she was doing me a favor by explaining it. Apparently, the HOA claimed I hadn't paid my dues for 2 years, plus some late fees, plus some maintenance costs they said they'd incurred to mow my property. The total, according to them, was just over $800. Here's the kicker. They said they'd sent multiple notices, and when I didn't respond, they filed a lien against the property. Then, in what they called a perfectly legal process, they foreclosed on the lien and sold the land at auction to cover the debt. I nearly dropped the phone. I had never received any notice of this lien or sale. And as far as I knew, the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act (SCRA) protected deployed military personnel from this exact sort of thing. I told her exactly that, and she got smug, saying, "Well, you weren't deployed the entire time, were you? You could have handled it between assignments." I wanted to reach through the phone. Instead, I bit down my temper and told her I'd be contacting my JAG office immediately. She just laughed and said, "You can try, but the sale's already final." That night, I didn't sleep much. My unit had enough going on without me being distracted, but my mind kept going back to those trees, that little creek, and the idea that these people thought they could get away with taking it from me while I was serving my country overseas. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. When I finally got some free time, I sat down with our legal officer and laid out the whole story. His eyes lit up when I mentioned the SCRA. "They can't do that," he said flatly. "Not without a court order, and definitely not without notifying you properly. And if they did it while you were deployed, they're in serious trouble." He started making calls right away. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, sworn statements, and angry back and forth between my military legal team and the HOA's attorney. It turned out the auction, where they sold my land, wasn't even a real open auction. It was more like a private sale to a friend of the board, for a fraction of the market value. My dues had been $50 a year, just like I remembered, but they'd piled on late fees, administrative costs, and even claimed they'd had to repair damage to my vacant lot. That so-called repair. They'd mowed it once. For $400. Meanwhile, the buyer, this friend of the board, had already started talking about clearing trees and building a workshop there. He was shocked when he got a letter from the military informing him that the sale was being contested and might be voided entirely. The HOA's smugness evaporated in record time. Suddenly, they were trying to negotiate with me, offering to let me buy my own land back for the amount they claimed I owed. I told them no. In fact, I told them I wasn't interested in just getting my land back. I wanted to see them held accountable. That's when my legal officer mentioned something that made me sit up straight. If they'd violated the SCRA, I could not only reverse the sale, but also seek damages. And given that this was a systemic issue, something they'd tried with other military members in the past, we could potentially bring in federal enforcement. It's funny how fast the tone changes when a small town HOA suddenly realizes they might be on the hook for federal penalties. They started scrambling, calling me at weird hours, begging to resolve the matter amicably. But by then, I'd learned enough about their shady practices to know this wasn't just about me anymore. They'd been doing this for years, snapping up land from deployed service members and selling it to insiders. While I still had missions to focus on overseas, I gave my legal team full authority to act on my behalf. They moved forward not just with the repossession of my land, but with a much broader case. I didn't know it yet, but that decision was going to lead to something much bigger than just reclaiming my little 2-acre lot. It was going to end with the military stepping in and taking over the entire subdivision. Would you like me to continue with part 2 so the story flows into how the repossession of the subdivision actually happened? Alright, here's a detailed, expanded 1,000-word version of part 1, keeping it engaging and narrative-driven. I had just stepped off the transport plane after a long deployment overseas, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that seeps in when you've been gone for months, living on adrenaline, grit, and instant coffee. The first thing I wanted was to drive down my quiet little street, walk through my front door, and breathe in the smell of my own home. My land wasn't big, just a modest lot with a small but sturdy house, but it was mine. I'd bought it years before, poured weekends into fixing it up, and even put up a little flagpole out front. While I was overseas, my neighbors sent me the occasional email with updates. Someone's dog had puppies, the HOA was fussing about trash can placement again, and the neighborhood Facebook group had devolved into a Cold War over mailbox decorations. I figured it was the usual suburban nonsense. But then, about 3 months before my return, the emails stopped. I didn't think much of it at the time, comms could be spotty where I was. When I finally got home, I drove down my street expecting to see my familiar little house with the blue shutters. Instead, I saw a massive, glaringly white, "For sale" sign staked right in the middle of my yard. At first, I thought maybe my neighbor's memory had gone fuzzy and he'd mistaken my place for another listing. But then I saw the fresh paint on my porch, white, not the blue I had carefully chosen, and new landscaping that looked nothing like mine. I pulled into the driveway, and before I could even put the truck in park, a stranger stepped out of my front door. A tall guy in cargo shorts, holding a set of keys that jingled like an accusation. Can I help you?" he asked, like I was the intruder. "Yeah," I said slowly. "This is my house. Who are you?" He frowned. "I just bought this place from the HOA. Got the deed and everything. Closed 2 weeks ago." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The HOA. I knew they could be petty. Fines for leaving your trash bin out too long, threatening letters if your grass was half an inch too tall, but selling my house. That was absurd. I told him there had to be a mistake. I was the legal owner, had been paying my mortgage and property taxes religiously, even from overseas. The man, looking increasingly uncomfortable, invited me in so I could see the paperwork. My living room was completely different, my furniture gone, my pictures taken down, replaced by his beige couch and generic wall art. But on the kitchen counter was a folder with all the closing documents. And there it was, a sale from the HOA to him, citing unpaid fines and failure to comply with HOA maintenance requirements as the reason for the seizure. Apparently, the HOA had filed liens against my property while I was gone. The violations included leaving unauthorized items in the yard, which turned out to be my neighbor's ladder leaning against my fence for 2 weeks, and not responding to multiple notices. Notices that, of course, had been mailed to my home address while I was deployed. The more I read, the more surreal it became. They had held a so-called auction, with no public announcement, where the only bidder was the HOA president's cousin. He had bought it for a fraction of the market value, then resold it to this man at full price. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I had served my country for months, missed birthdays, holidays, and comfort, only to come home and find that a bunch of neighborhood busybodies had stolen my land right out from under me. The new owner, to his credit, seemed genuinely sorry. He said he'd had no idea about my deployment, and that if he had, he probably would have backed out. But he wasn't about to just hand it back, he'd sunk his savings into it. I couldn't exactly blame him for that, but my fury wasn't aimed at him anyway. It was aimed squarely at the HOA. That night, I barely slept. Instead, I went through every single document, every letter, every shady bit of paperwork I could find. And the deeper I dug, the more rotten it smelled. They had violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act, which specifically protects deployed service members from losing their property due to things like unpaid fines or default judgments while they're away. They hadn't just skirted the law, they had stomped on it. The next day, I called a lawyer I knew from my unit, someone who specialized in military legal protections. When I told him the story, there was a long pause on the line, and then he said, "Oh, they are going to regret this." We got to work immediately. He contacted the Department of Justice, the State Attorney General, and even my commanding officer. Within a week, it wasn't just me going after them, it was multiple branches of the federal government. And once the military lawyers got involved, it escalated quickly. The HOA president tried to bluster his way through a phone call, claiming they had followed procedure, and that military service doesn't exempt you from responsibility. He clearly had no idea what kind of storm was coming for him. By week 3, federal marshals were involved. By week 4, the sale had been voided, the title restored to me, and the HOA was under investigation for fraud, racketeering, and misuse of funds. But it didn't stop there. See, once the investigators started digging into their records, they found that this wasn't the first time they'd pulled this stunt. They'd done it to other residents, elderly people, folks in financial hardship, always through the same secret auction scheme. That was when the hammer truly dropped. The DOJ froze their accounts. The state seized their assets. And because the HOA had used communal funds to conduct these illegal sales, the entire subdivision was now tied up in legal limbo. No one could sell, refinance, or even make major renovations until the mess was sorted. The property values tanked overnight. Meanwhile, my case became something of a local news sensation. Reporters loved the soldier versus HOA angle, and every interview I gave just seemed to make the HOA look worse. Residents started turning on the board, furious that their neighborhood was now radioactive to buyers. And when the HOA president finally resigned, it was too late, the subdivision was already circling the drain. The day I moved back into my house, I planted a new flagpole in the yard. A bigger one. The neighbors waved, some sheepishly avoiding eye contact, others openly cheering me on. As for the HOA's fancy clubhouse, the military had repossessed it as part of the settlement for their illegal actions. I heard it's now being used for National Guard training drills. I didn't just get my home back, I got justice. And every time I mow my lawn now, I do it with a smile, knowing the people who tried to steal my land lost everything. Dash dash dash. Do you want me to continue with part 2 in the same level of expanded detail, where the military repossession part kicks into high gear? That's where it gets even more intense.